Chapter 1. Why Bother, Brother? Oh boy, just what the world needs, another book on prophecy. Must be 1,000 of them already, exploring every theory and nuance of biblical eschatology. Surely everything that can be said has been said. Well, perhaps, but with all that's been written, there's a surprisingly broad range of opinion about what it all means, and it isn't terribly hard to see why. The very way the predictions have come down to us invites controversy. Many of them don't seem to make any sense, right up to the moment of their fulfillment, at which point we all nod knowingly and say, of course, the prophet described this very thing. In some places, the Bible speaks of things yet to come in language that sounds as strange to us as the visions and revelations must have seemed to the prophets who wrote them down. There were no words in Hebrew or Greek for much of what they saw. They simply did their best to describe it. So we get phrases like, the heaven rolled up like a scroll, or the moon turned to blood. What in the world does that mean? In other places, God chose to present the prophet with a symbol of some future reality, making it obvious from the outset that something else, something more significant, is meant. So Joseph sees sheaves of grain bending over and skinny cows eating fat ones, and he knows God is telling him something important is going to happen. Daniel sees a big statue, and he knows God is revealing truth, not critiquing Scripture. Sometimes the prophet is told to write things down that he couldn't possibly comprehend. In Psalm 22, for example, King David describes the horrors of a method of execution, crucifixion, that wouldn't even be invented for another 500 years. Did he know what he was talking about? Not likely, but God did. Throughout the Bible, God uses prophecy to reveal himself. If you think about it, foretelling the future is one of the few things the true and living God can do to prove his deity. Sure, he demonstrates his power, his love, his mercy all day, every day, in 1,000 different ways. But men, fools that we are, have developed an amazing talent for explaining away the obvious handiwork of our Creator. When he tells us what will come to pass, however, he's putting his reputation on the line. He's saying, in effect, only God, who transcends time, could know what will happen in your future. Because I love you, I'm going to tell you what to expect. When it happens exactly as I said it was, it'll prove that you can trust me with your soul, too. Then you'll know that I am God. When no less a personality than John the Baptist began having doubts about the credentials of Yahshua, Jesus, he proved that he was the Messiah by pointing out the prophecies he'd fulfilled. You don't see other religions' gods stating the future as if it were a fact because, frankly, it's really embarrassing when their predictions don't come true. Whether God promises to make the prophesied event happen himself or is merely predicting it, only the true deity can flawlessly predict the future, because only the true deity exists beyond the bounds of time. But wait, you say, other religions besides Judeo-Christianity have prophets. One in particular, Islam, boasts well over 1 billion adherents. We'll talk more about Islam later because it plays a big part in the Bible's revelation of the end of the world as we know it. But let's clear this little misconception up at the outset. Though all of Islam's, quote-quote, prophets, save one, Muhammad, were borrowed from the Judeo-Christian scriptures, none of them count, since the Muslim writings flatly contradict everything these prophets, Adam, Noah, Lot, Abraham, Joseph, and even Jesus, if you believe the translations, had to say. As for its final, and truth its only, prophet, Muhammad never uttered a single prophecy that came to pass, not one. He did make 1 or 2 prognostications, however. He said that women would outnumber men 100 to 1, wishful thinking, I suppose. And then there was that little prediction about the end of the world, Judgment Day, coming in what amounted to 1110 A.D. I'd say he missed that one by just a tad. It's really easy to tell people what your God is like and what he wants you to do if you're making him up as you go along, as Muhammad did. For example, when Islam's God ostensibly gave this prophet a new revelation permitting him a plethora of wives when everybody else was limited to a paltry 4 apiece, Muhammad's child wife Aisha wryly noted, "Your Lord certainly seems anxious to gratify your desires." Yes, indeed. It's one thing to come up with convenient prophecies that bestow upon the prophet his heart's every desire, sex, money, power, revenge, all of which were bestowed upon Muhammad through timely revelations from his Lord. It's something else entirely for a prophet to prove his God's deity by relating his flawless grasp of and control over future events. And prophecy is important, especially today. I mean, miracles can be faked. If you don't believe me, show up at your local cinema some Saturday afternoon and watch a blockbuster action movie. I guarantee you'll see things being done that are impossible. What you won't see, though, is the miracle of prophecy. Someone seriously predicting things like, mean old Mrs. Jones is going to get eaten by wild dogs on the front steps of the county courthouse in Prattville, Kansas, and they won't leave enough corpse to bother burying, only to see it all come true a few months later. It's not that it's too gory to get a PG-13 rating, you understand. It's only that it's too hard to predict. After all, mean old Mrs. Jones might get hit by a bus instead, or get eaten by wild dogs outside the Kmart in Wichita, or live happily ever after, for that matter. You want reality? Okay. God, through his prophet Elijah, predicted something very similar would happen to mean old Mrs. Ahab, a.k.a. Israel's Queen Jezebel. And that prophecy came about precisely as he'd foretold it in all its bloody details. You can find the story in 2 Kings 9, verse 10, and verses 30 to 37. And that was an easy one. Some of the Bible's prophecies, already fulfilled, mind you, are so complex and unlikely they'll make your head swim. As a matter of fact, at least a quarter of the Bible was prophetic when it was written. That's a chunk of text roughly the size of the New Testament, all speaking of things that hadn't happened yet, future history, so to speak. Over 500 specific prophecies have already come to pass. That leaves an ever-shrinking list yet to be fulfilled. Many of them must have seemed like the ravings of mystic lunatics when they were handed down. Yet as the years pass, they're beginning to sound more like the observations of calm and objective reporters writing articles for today's, or maybe tomorrow's, newspapers. Where it used to take faith in large doses to believe God's prophecies, now it only takes an open mind and a decent grasp of current events. But like I said, there must be 1,000 books on end-time prophecy already. What possible reason could there be for writing another one? Well, I can't say I've read everything there is on the subject, but the scores of books I have read invariably fall into one of 3 camps. First are the surface treatments, those thin volumes intended for Christians new to the subject or new to the faith. Because they're meant to be introductions or overviews, they rarely do more than help the reader get his feet wet, and by their very nature ask him to swallow their message whole, to take it or leave it, the inevitable speculation and interpretation, along with the concrete biblical fact. The second category is comprised of those weighty and erudite tomes that dig deep and explain everything in excruciating detail. I must confess, I love this stuff, dense as it is, written by respected and dedicated scholars with legendary names like Walward and Pentecost and Ryrie. These tend to examine the trees under a microscope, leaving the forest more or less incomprehensible to us mortals. I thank God these men understand the Bible so well. Now, if I could only understand them. And then are the special agenda books, those with an axe to grind or an issue to explore. You've seen them. They defend to the death their position on a pre-tribulation versus post-tribulation rapture, or vice versa. or their stance on premillennialism versus postmillennialism versus amillennialism. Or perhaps the author wants to explore numerology, hidden Bible codes, the Mideast oil situation, Islamic terrorism, or his current theory on who the Antichrist might be. These have gotten quite popular of late. All of these approaches can be valuable in their own way, but what I keep hearing from my friends and family is, yes, but I still don't get it. What happens? Why? When? There are too many theories and not enough concrete fact, too much data and not enough usable information. I'm convinced that the usable information is available between the covers of the Bible, if only we're willing to dig for it. And the answers that aren't there are either beside the point or hidden for our own good. God has told us far more than most of us realize. What will happen to the church in the last days? What's on the horizon for Israel, America, Europe, and the Orient? How does the scourge of Islam figure into all this? Why will World War III start, and how will it end? Who will fight World War IV, and when, and why? All of this is explained, not only the bare facts, but also the reasons these events will occur. Many people today are familiar with the buzzwords of prophecy, terms like rapture, tribulation, antichrist, Armageddon, millennium, and judgment day. But few realize the depths of detail of which God has predicted the coming events. Christians glance at Jesus' declaration that,
"Of that day and hour no one knows," Matthew 24:36.
and shrug their shoulders, concluding that the timing must all be a big mystery. Almost no one realizes that God has told us precisely to the day when he would begin his millennial reign, when the Antichrist would take over the earth, when the Great Tribulation would begin, and a plethora of similar last days milestones. The only thing we're not told is the date of the rapture, the event to which Jesus was referring. And even then, we are told the day on which it will fall, just not the year. We've also been given a scriptural thermometer so that we can tell when we're getting warm. It was no pointless fluke that God revealed these events to his apostles and prophets who wrote them down for our edification. He wants us to know what will happen, just as he wants us to know what happened in the past. Judeo-Christianity is the only faith on earth that has a foothold in history, both past and future. As for me, I find that strangely comforting. Strangely, because what's coming is terrifying, almost too horrible to contemplate. It will make the killing fields of the 20th century seem trivial by comparison. Billions will die. We will come to within an inch of witnessing the destruction of all life on this fragile planet. But I am comforted because I know how it all ends. Christ's victorious return saves the day. Okay, I'll come clean. I'm comforted because I don't expect to be here when all the nastiness happens. I'll be raptured if I don't die first. Considering my age, I give rapture about a 50-50 chance. That's a guess, of course, but one I've been led to by a truckload of scriptural evidence. Evidence that dovetails nicely when you lay it all out in front of you. There's an obscure old James Taylor song whose lyrics have haunted me for years. One of the verses says, quote, "We've got the Holy Scriptures here that prove us to be right in believing out loud what we wish to be true," unquote. A very astute observation, James. Christians have made a contact sport out of taking Bible passages out of context and using them as a club with which to beat our heathen neighbors as well as our less enlightened brothers and sisters over the head. Our arrogance can truly be a thing of wonder sometimes. On the other hand, we are told to search the Scriptures, to test the spirits, to guard against false teaching and heresy. Is there a contradiction here? Not really. Digging out the truth and standing upon it is not at all the same thing as ferreting out isolated texts to prove what we wish to be true.